panel, Héctor Aguirre, manager of the International Grouping of Municipalities Rio Lempa in Central America, Ms. Camila Dabañino, Councillor of Santiago de Chile, Manuela Carmena, President of the Association Cuidar la Democracia from Spain, Ms. Dolors Camats, Director of the Foundation Catalunya Europa, and Mr. Francisco Javier Ayala, Mayor of Fuenlabrada, and Renske Steenbergen, Deputy Director of the Association of Dutch Municipalities. So thank you very much for being here. We will try to keep the time, but the important thing here is to discuss. So you have the floor, Agustí Fernández de Losada. This is my microphone. Yes, it is. Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here moderating this panel with people who have very relevant things to say about democracy, about decentralization and local governments, a topic which I believe is of a great concern to us all. Both Latin America and Europe live or are in a context of a certain degree, and I would like to underline the word certain democracy disappointment. The last survey points out that 42% of European populations are not satisfied with democracy in Latin America. The latest survey points out that 48% of the population is unsatisfied with democracy, and 17%, and this is risen in recent years, backs up authoritarianism. All of this in a context, and we've talked about this on several occasions already, of multiple crises that have a dimension and impact which is very clear in the territory. We have geopolitical tensions in our scenario. We have a war in Central Europe with impacts all over the place, very clear impacts in our societies. The war in Ukraine, very recently, there's been worsening of the conflict between the Gaza Strip and Israel, Palestine and Israel in the Gaza Strip, which is very much related to what we were mentioning a while ago on human rights. The context of this population in the Gaza Strip subjected to a vulnerability, extreme vulnerability situation. We are also in a moment of increase of inequalities and emergence of new ways of inequalities in Europe and Latin America. Poverty very particularly has accelerated in both regions after the pandemic especially. And this topic of inequality is something that, from the local perspective, needs to be brought onto the table as one of the main concerns. Inequalities that lead on to fragmentation and have the marginalization of many problems. Here on these panels, we have multiple transitions as well from climate perspective. Society is trying to make progress towards climate neutrality, technological disruption, inequalities again generated by the digitization processes, and we are in a moment of social tensions. There's been movements that have expressed their unhappiness with this in Latin America, but also in Europe. Violence has become a structural problem, an endemic problem that needs to be tackled locally. And all this is accompanied by a rise in nationalism and populism, and also very clearly, not only in Latin America or Europe, but globally, there's been an increase in authoritarianism. This is the cocktail that we have on the table now. And this cocktail in which local governments need to operate. In Europe, we have contexts such as the ones we see in Hungary, and the contexts such as the one we're seeing in Poland. We have elections of governments such as the one in Italy. We can look at what is happening in Spain or what can happen shortly in France. But let's not forget that one or some of the most relevant governments that have been victorious in elections in Latin America, I'm thinking about Colombia, Chile, Brazil, those governments have won before the far-right parties with a very small margin. And a few days ago, we have this first round of elections in Argentina, where one of the two options, which will go to the second round, also represents those far-right populistic approaches, which, in my opinion, is very concerning. So before this situation, it is relevant and important, going back to what is local, to wonder whether there's this disappointment with democracy, and what can we do locally to tackle this challenge, this risk, this disappointment, and what can local governance do, and what can local governments do in all this. Local governments very frequently, and I can give you many contexts that are defined as spaces of resistance in the face of authoritarianism, but we can also claim that there are local governments that are being governed by populistic, nationalistic, and far-right options. It is not something that belongs only to national governments. It can also affect local governments. And simultaneously, and as a symptom of all this, we are experiencing a recentralization process, a process of recovery of this vigor of the nation state that is once again recentralizing power. And this is taking place in Europe, I believe. And in CIDOP, we have studied this. The management of the recovery funds in Spain and in other countries as well is clearly defined by this recentralizing attempt. Local governments have had very little maneuvering margin to design their own budgets and reforms behind that recovery effort. And in Latin America, we have contexts that, well, are very concerning, such as the one we're seeing in El Salvador and, well, Nicaragua and other countries as well. So a situation referring to decentralization of power. That is quite a concern. So we need to wonder whether we're capable of placing the agenda of decentralization at the center of our conversations, discussions, the relationships between Europe and Latin America. Is it worthwhile to talk about tax decentralization, multi-level governance, many technical things that are very relevant so that local governments can continue providing a response to the issues in the tensioned context of citizens. And this and many other things have been brought onto the table. And I believe these are topics that we can discuss, and we really want to hear our speakers, as Milagros was saying. We're very lucky to have Manuela Carmena here with us, former mayoress of Madrid, Dolors Camats, Director of the Foundation Catalunya Europa, Héctor Aguirre, Manager of the International Grouping of Municipalities Rio Lempa, Camila de Bajino, Councillor of Santiago de Chile, Renske Steenbergen, Deputy Director of VNG International, and Javier Ayala, Mayor of Fuenlabrada. And I'm going to ask you specific questions to each one of you. I'm going to do 2 rounds of questions, and I will ask you to use around or approximately 3 minutes to respond. It's not an easy task because these are very questions with wide answers and extensive answers, but I'll ask you to summarize, please. And after the first round, you can actually answer each other. I'm sure there's nuances you would like to add. And we will go to the next round to then hear also from the audience, from everybody, just to finish with the discussion.
Camats.
So I'll start off by Dolors Camats with a simple but relevant question. Is democracy at risk? Thank you, Arosti, for making it so easy for me and for giving me time to explain this. You saying I'll give some figures. I also had some figures to show whether it's true or not that our citizens are questioning public institutions. And to say the least, if we look at European figures, things don't look bright. Spaniards give a fail to all public institutions except the healthcare system. We fail our city councils, what a surprise, but also regional governments, the state, the parliament, the European Union, the judiciary, and the one with the worst grade are political parties. Europeans have a slightly higher level of trust on average compared to Spaniards, and they also give a negative grade to state parliaments and political parties in a very obvious way. If we ask citizens whether they believe that the media or misinformation and fake news or the messages that put democracy at risk, more than 80% of Europeans and Spaniards believe that misinformation is a risk for democracy. And if we add to this, and this is my own piece of added information, it's something, when Agustí gives us 3 minutes to answer a complex question, I'd say that we have turned politics into political communication today. We ask it to be short, brief, sexy in its messages. We want it to fit in a tweet, and we want everyone to understand. So we've simplified political messages and communication, hiding from our citizens and from our population all of the complexity in public matters, all of the complexity behind global challenges, the difficulties that administrations encounter vis-a-vis the economic or private powers, or vis-a-vis other administrations when it comes to overcoming these problems. So we're hiding from our citizens. We could say we make the political discourse easy for them to digest and infantile. So, yes, at the end of the day, when you cannot meet citizens' expectations, well, the level of mistrust grows and deception vis-a-vis political institutions and the democratic framework are eroded. It's paradoxical in a forum like this, if you'll allow me to say so, where so many people at a Spanish level, but also in Latin America, have literally risked their lives to move from dictatorships to democratic systems. It's paradoxical that so quickly we have forgotten about all of these struggles and are now questioning the democratic system. We see many threats. People are questioning whether the democratic system is the one that is best suited to resolve the problems we face as society. We have far-right movements, authoritarian regimes, but we also have global actors, which are the elephant in the room, I'd say. Global actors who are suggesting that perhaps the democratic system as we know it today, with this heavy load of human rights and gender equality, with a heavy load of giving political subjectivity to all people, is the best suited system for all countries, of all systems. So there's this questioning of the system from within and from without the democratic systems. At the end of the day, when we talk of democracy, we are talking of political participation and freedoms. We are referring to human rights and the guarantees for these human rights to be exercised. It's not just a mere statement of principles. And we are talking of justice, social and environmental justice, in the sense that people's living conditions, the living conditions of citizens, are to allow them to exercise these rights, freedoms, and to participate in politics. So, yes, it is true that with time we have come up with more demands for the democratic system in terms of the rights, in terms of quantity and complexity, and we have also added further demands when it comes to finding new solutions to demands that the public system hadn't dealt with traditionally. Management aspects, but also economic equality or public intervention to guarantee people's living conditions. And to this we must add the context in which we are living. As Agostí was saying, the context is much more complex today, and you can see it. If I read a list: corruption, lack of coherence, mistrust, indifference, uncertainty, fear, rapid changes that change our personal lives, political polarization, and most importantly, the diversity and complexity of our societies. We are much more diverse. There are many more of us who want to have the right to exist, women with a voice of their own, but also other groups, and we are much more unequal. This is the playing field for this democracy which we are demanding more and more from. So I'll conclude by saying the only solution, we could say, is to accept this complexity and to accept that the legitimacy of democracy is directly linked to its ability to overcome all of these situations and to meet people's needs. So we can't raise our expectations because elections are around the corner, but we can neither hide away the realities and the difficulties that the administrations face when it comes to solving issues. If I have to deal with health issues linked to mobility, I can't manage how many cars enter my city. So being honest when confronting complexity and different realities, there's a need to be useful to meet the expectations, and if there's something I can't solve, I need to be honest and say this. And I'll conclude by saying that this last element, which I don't think has been mentioned so far, is that it's not only important what we do and how, that is usefulness and being honest. We need to be clear on the purpose, what for, knowing that we have a shared purpose, knowing that there are elements that bring us together as a community, knowing that I belong to a community, even if I'm very different from others and very unequal from others, but knowing that there are elements that bring us together as a group is something that can be built from politics and institutions. And this is something we should feel called upon to act, because I don't know if we are recognizing how important this is in terms of collective leadership for common projects and causes. This gives me a sense of belonging, and therefore it means that any problem affecting a community will affect me too. And I think this is what makes democracy stronger. Thank you so much, Zulo. It's clear then that we are faced with an extremely complex scenario, and I think it's time to ask ourselves, what can we do at a local level? What can local governments do to tackle the risks for democracy? For some years now, we've heard the former mayor of Madrid, Manuela Carmena, to refer to the need of taking care of our democracy, and I wanted to ask you more about this. How can we take care of democracy at a local level? Thank you so much to you all for being here. I'll try answering the question asked by the moderator. I must start off by saying, just so that you can understand what I'm trying to explain, is my surprise. I was the mayor of Madrid. I was elected mayor of Madrid when I was 70 years old. I was quite old. I was retired at the age, and when I arrived in politics, I had a totally different perspective. I came from the field of law, where we discussed things in courts of justice. We exchanged opinions. We obviously didn't lie or insult one another. So my first impression, when I reached the plenary session in the City Council of Madrid and I saw that the political dialogue had been reduced to the strategy of insults and lack of respect, the most audacious and funny lack of respect, I saw there was no true reflection on what was really important, and that is the program we had to develop for our city. It shocked me, I must admit. I was wondering what's going on here. And that is why I've made an effort to try and convey, I tried at the time, and obviously after my 4-year mandate, I've tried to convey the need to take care of our democracy. What do I mean by taking care of democracy? Well, I believe that to talk about caring for democracy, I must refer to something that is gaining protagonism in our political discourse when talking of progress, and that is the term care we talk about. The care economy, the need to have care policies. But dear friends, what do we mean when we say care for something? I can give you an example which I hope you may find useful. First and foremost, the verb to care refers to a feminine, hugely feminine attitude. It's been women who, throughout history, have cared for other people's lives, our families, our young, our elderly. And women continue to take care. Think of how we care for a baby or how we take care of a plant. I love gardening. Or how do we take care of our pet? Caring basically involves the first activity, and that is to look at things, observe, listen. We cannot take care of anything unless we look at what we are taking care of and what are the needs of the thing or the person we are caring for. I remember seeing a mother with a young kid. The kid wasn't putting on any weight, and she would go to the chemist, and the doctor was looking at the kid. Maybe you have a plant, you bought it in a greenhouse, it was looking beautiful, and then at home the leaves go yellow. What do? You look at it, right? Why do we look at this? Well, because to care for something, we have to look at what the nature of the problem to be cared for is. We need to examine, evaluate, and then give what we're caring for what it needs. I think this concept needs to be made clear because and I'm totally in favorable of saying that political activity includes care. We do politics to care, to study the society we are serving and to provide society with what we think society needs to achieve its purpose. Okay, so let's take a look at democracy. If we look at democracy, we will see that we've been with democracies for a century and a half, but the way we do practice democracy is outdated. It's from the end of the 19th century. And for those of you reading in Spanish, and those who don't understand Spanish, you can translate it easily. There's a politician from the end of the 19th century, Gumersindo Azcárate, who wrote a booklet on his observations to parliamentary democracy at the time. It's available on the internet. You won't find it in a hard copy, but it's available on the internet. If you read this booklet, you will see that what we are really now realizing that is eroding democracy already appeared a century and a half ago. But we continue with the same old discussions, using the same parliamentary structures, with exactly the same composition of a majority and a minority. We've copied these old models, but we've commodified them. Dolores clearly said that we have turned something that was starting to get stuck at the start of the last century, and now in the 21st century, we've seen that everything's been commodified, and democracy has been commodified. I could talk about this topic for hours. There's much more I could say about it. But in any case, I'd like to say that we must realize what isn't working in democracy. There are many things that aren't working. We need to analyze them, study them, correct them. But that takes time. And since there are important measures to be adopted, especially in the realm that is more accessible for processes of transformation, that is local governments, we have to start thinking of what we can do in local governments. The first thing we have to do in local governments is to start measuring something we repeat and say again and again. We say that local governments are the ones closest to our citizens. Why? I would like it very much if we could carry out surveys as to what do we mean when we say we're the closest to our citizens. We could ask a citizen, have you ever spoken to your mayor? Have you ever been able to meet a city councillor in your shop? How long does it take for a problem to be solved when you go to an agency? Have your suggestions ever been enacted? There are many other questions of this kind, but let's start off by stop repeating something that we haven't checked. Are local governments the closest to their citizens? We have to analyze and see what we should do. In the meantime, while political transformation processes that involve a different conception of parties, a different way of debating, let's all think how parliamentary discussions take place. I was totally baffled when there were the control sessions. I don't know if in all countries and in all cities you have control sessions, but in the Spanish municipal framework, the discussions in plenary sessions replicate the discussions in the parliament, national parliaments, where they control the executive and they ask questions, and no one has an interest in answering these questions. The only interest is, before allowing the person to answer, is to fill a discourse full of insults, lies, lack of respect. So I think we have to look at different ways of allowing our citizens to participate in politics. I firmly defend that we should test out random participation, because this eliminates party structures which in a wrong way understand that parties have to govern the executive, whether it's local, federal or central. I say no. Parties are something different. Parties shouldn't govern. It's the people who have been elected who have to govern. So let's try doing something really interesting. Let's have random participation. In the Town Council of Madrid, we created our own control mechanism to be controlled and to be made accountable, which also allowed citizens to participate and make suggestions. We randomly selected 48 people to ensuring that there was proper representation. We didn't see the final outcome of this new mechanism because we didn't have the possibility of continuing. We won the elections, but the right-wing party and the far right-wing party created an alliance. But we were able to see 48 people randomly elected. There was an 80-year-old person in one committee and a 17-year-old in another committee, and they didn't insult each other. They talked of what was truly important to them. It was a really interesting example. We have this figure in our popular juries and other. It's really interesting because, among others, I would suggest we should try this new system. Why not?
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carmena. Taking advantage that we have another mayor sitting at the table, I'd like to go into this a bit more. What can we do from a local level? Manuela Carmena was mentioning the need to make democracy evolve, to have a greater participation of citizens, to work in a more closer way. What can we do from a local government such as that of Fuenlabrada? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure participating in this forum. And let me clarify, I didn't even have the opportunity to greet Manuela Carmena before she took the floor. It's like a second chapter of her intervention, because I was going to talk about citizen participation. We hadn't agreed on this, but my intervention was going to talk about the model in Fuenlabrada where citizens participate. And this citizen participation, let me tell you where it has taken us in just 40 or 50 years. Fuenlabrada is a city that in 45 or 50 years has gone from having 6,000 or 7,000 inhabitants to 200,000. It's been a huge growth in population. Members of the Council here talk of when they talk of the growth of a city, they use us as an example. Thing worked out well, but they could have gone very wrong. This huge growth in a little time frame is difficult to manage, and I would like to say that the citizens' participation, which is what I want to focus on, the organized participation of organizations. It's a city where we have more than 1,000 local organizations. This allows us for the governing team to have an important social network of important associations thinking about whether it's sports or whatever field they represent, but thinking about the city. I always say that a mayor can know a lot about something or not. There are many mayors that know nothing. But if they have the support and collaboration of local associations and groups, they're less likely to make a mistake. If there are more of us, the chances of making a mistake are less, or at least it will be many more people making a mistake than if it's just one person decided. So I'd like to say that this exponential growth, I mean, we designed our model in Fuenlabrada around a model of social integration that we put into practice even before. I mean, we were practicing interculturality before the concept was coined and before the concept had developed so much as it has now. So as part of this huge growth in the 1970s and 80s, we had a first wave of migration from almost all regions from around Spain. We have people from Andalusia, from Galicia, from central Spain. And I think one thing we did well was to come together as regions. And this was a really interesting instrument for the city, because obviously if you can participate together with your neighbors, people with whom you share a culture, it's great. And these structures were really interesting. And these structures also brought the full value of the city of Fuenlabrada. We didn't only just gather in the regional houses in Fuenlabrada. We felt we found common grounds to come together, like those of us coming from Andalusia, and we were able to share with people coming from Galicia and other regional houses. And this is what leads me to say that we were practicing interculturality before the term existed. In the year 2000, we had the second wave of migrants, people coming from other countries from around the world, and who arrived in Fuenlabrada. And this situation, we channeled it through the Board for Coexistence. It's a board made up of 40 organizations where you have the regional houses represented in the city, and where you also have representation of different groups, people from other countries who came together around their culture. And the goal was shared, or there were two shared goals. Obviously, one shared goal was to be in touch with people from your homeland and the same origins as yours. And the fundamental goal for me as a mayor and for the governing team is the goal to get Fuenlabrada to grow, to gain in relevance, to have a more inhabitable city where we can live in a much better way. So we went from the 70s to the 21st century with a model which, as I said, I mean, we are living at a time where pompous discourse and great concepts prevail. They're all great and they're very enriching, but sometimes with the small details and nuances is where we can find big transformation. That is why Strong Cities invited us, together with other 90 cities, to share what's happened over these past 40 years, or the Council of Europe calls on us very often to explain how we've channeled this interculturality, which is so important to a city like ours. And I heard political representatives from other cities who also stress the importance of interculturality for many Latin American cities. And we can all learn from how we do things. They can learn from us and we can learn from them. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mayor. Next, Manuela Carmena was telling us that the verb care carries a strong feminine load. And she also said that practicing politics involves care. So I would like to ask our Chilean colleague, how can we improve the quality of democracy? Hi everyone, hello everyone. I am Camila Davanino, Councilor of the Santiago de Chile, and I'm here representing my mayor Iracy Hunter. Before answering your question, I think I need to share some background, pointing out what my colleague said in this case, my colleague who was in the previous panel. In Chile, we are undergoing a very complex process. We have a second proposal on a new constitution which emerged from discontent and an institutional crisis which led to a process that we are now moving on with. It'll be submitted to a vote. We know it'll fail, so we won't have a new constitution. As the mayor said, we are experiencing a migration wave. In Latin America, we saw until recently migration had happened differently. We have intense migration waves that affect us culturally, and also it affects the role of local government. So, and another point is what was mentioned on security. It's not a crisis, but maybe the scenario now is different from some years ago. And another thing that's been mentioned and which called my attention, and I'm surprised to see this happening in Europe, after the COVID, local governments have gained relevance in providing answers, and they were the ones having to manage the crisis, for good or for worse. So the relevant role that cities took on in responding to the situation in Chile was important, and it placed cities in public conversation. So they weren't just talking about parliamentary politics, but they also started to see mayors taking on important roles. So bearing this context in mind, and bearing in mind that we made it to the City Council of Santiago through a citizens' movement of social organizations that built a program and came up with a different program. I think our contribution, and going back to the question of feminism in democracy, I could summarize it in several words that were used in previous panels. Feminism, as a movement for civilization, brings a lens that we should be able to study and look at. It's about combining the concept of care with that of security in a broad spectrum of security, not just referring to citizens' security, but talking also of social security and what it means to feel safe, protected, and cared for. So we need to look at how, from the feminist movement, we can contribute to this through the search for equality. And we need to look at how feminism can be a safeguard for everyone that's been left outside in terms of women's participation and advocacy, the participation of migrant people, minors, elderly, and others. So in this quest for a more active political participation and a more active participation of our citizens and providing a safe haven to reach equality, that is where I think local governments play an important role. And the question Manuela asked us about what does it mean when we say that local governments are the ones closest to our citizens. Well, it has to do with the fact that we try finding answers to our citizens' demands through concrete action for people who are unsatisfied with democracy, who have a great level of mistrust with regards to institutions. And in the case of Chile, they very often perceive the state structures as being slow and far away from citizens and are slow at managing crisis. So going back to your question, I believe that feminism and the concrete actions that we can come up with at a city council to boost rights and the equality of women in this case, well, I think there's a lot we can do. In Santiago, we have done quite a lot in terms of the care system. We have brigades that have been set up throughout the municipality, and we have other levels of participation that are also interesting that I hope I will be able to discuss in the second round, which has to do with participatory budgets, which are also part of a deep-rooted tradition. We have neighborhood councils, not just to talk about anything, but to talk about uh, children's affairs, neighborhood councils where neighbors can talk about security, and how the advice given by these neighborhood councils have been included in politics, and looking at how women experience insecurity. So at the end of the day, this helps to grow democracy and citizen participation. That is what it was designed for, right? So that neighbors can express their ideas, and I think this is a positive contribution in a complex scenario. As I was saying, we are trying to change the Chilean constitution, and I think it'll be the local authorities that will resist and will try finding answers to this. Thank you.
Muy bien.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're once again hearing this idea of resistance from the local sphere. This is something that should make us reflect and think. I'm going to Central America, I'm going to El Salvador, or that transnational territory. Hector, we are experiencing a re-centralizing power in Europe and Latin America, but that has been very clearly seen in the case of El Salvador. What can you tell us about this perspective? Well, thank you to the Barcelona Provincial Council to be part of this dialogue, of this forum, to try to take this discussion to a wider space, which is the European Union and CELAC space. There's three elements I would like to rescue on the topic of decentralization, which is not only the only thing that is happening in Central America. There is a strong setback of democracy, re-centralization of with the typical examples that are of concern, but there's also an accelerated elimination of human rights in Central America. Aide said so this morning in a panel where human rights is a great absent in many state policies. In the case of democracy, the most emblematic case is the case of Guatemala. When there's a popular election, there's the popular will, expressed popular will in the vote, and the factic power, the real power that don't want to allow for the legal system or the chosen president to take on the presidency on the 14th of January. This is unprecedented when there's a clear winner of the elections. But there is some subterfuges and ploys that are being arranged so that this president doesn't take over power. In the case of recentralization of the states, there's another flagship case, unfortunately, that we're going to mention here, and it is the following. El Salvador is going towards the elimination of municipal autonomy, re-centralization of the state. It eliminates of the 10% of the national budget. This is reduced to 1.5%. I there said so also, with a series of examples. So local governments, are the small box of the central government. In the case of El Salvador, it is an impressive reduction of local governments as entities that are close to citizens, as the former mayor of Madrid said. So for the Central American case, which is, realities are very different, but for the Central American case, this reduction of the autonomy, the elimination of the budget, represents a true setback to local development. And I'm sure that in 10 years' time, we cannot measure this in 10 years' time, but those decisions taken by the government in Salvador now will entail huge change in migration movements, poverty, marginalization, and phenomena that we will face in the future. We can't measure this now because citizens are applauding these decisions of central government, understanding that this government has taken dramatic actions eliminating human rights of citizens through 19 acts, month after month, in 9 consecutive months, eliminating constitutional rights of citizens in El Salvador to get rid of bands and gangs, and 35,000 innocent people have been affected by this. 35,000, over 300 have been killed in prisons. So innocent people that have been killed in prisons. So these are the cases where the population, unfortunately, no longer cares about democracy, rather the reduction of violence. So this phenomenon in El Salvador is not the best to be taken in Latin America. It is a catastrophe. We cannot yet measure it. And in the case of Nicaragua, unfortunately, there is the best example that we have here. She will be awarded for her fight for human rights today. When citizenship is taken away from you, when you lose democracy, we are at a critical moment in Central America. It is very serious and very deep, and we consider that these discussions, taken to different levels as well, will allow us to have a voice in terms of local governments, so that these phenomena have a different focus, it is said, to hear what our colleagues in the morning said, that the great discussion between CELAC and EU was the economic topic. There's no discussion on human rights, on green transition. But what good does it do if we can't live in our societies, if we find it so difficult? As opposed to your realities here, and the colleague from Italy mentioned this, you have difficulties in terms of public service delivery, but we don't have accessible services over there. Many people in El Salvador need to go to healthcare service providers there because it's the only way of having access to healthcare. Going to a different country to be cured because the service is slightly better. So the fight, the effort, so that these impacts in these populations are reduced, this is just huge. And not only we are a territory of migrants, we send lots of migrants to Europe and the US. We're also a migration passage, and the phenomenon is very complex. To give you an idea, the small cities of 20,000 inhabitants, 30,000 inhabitants are receiving daily from 3,000 to 5,000 migrants per day coming from all around the world, Venezuela, Haiti, Africa. This is a capacity that we don't have to attend to so many migrants moving towards the US. Entire families. It's just impressive seeing families with 2, 3 children in their arms just walking along our roads towards the United States. This is just an impressive phenomenon. Pateras, these vessels, overcrowded vessels for you here in the seas. It's huge, complex phenomena happening for us in the US as well. And local governments, with the problems, with our own natural problems that we have, if we add on the migration problems, which are much more complex, organized crime has been also unleashed. And it's the economy of the drug trafficking. Yes, you said so before. So it is a complex phenomenon, no doubt about that. Thank you so much, Hector. Yes, well, indeed. Central America, El Salvador, Nicaragua. We are in the face of hugely complex realities, but not just in those two countries. It goes far beyond that. I would like now to, looking at Renske, to ask you, within that context of complexity, what can the decentralized cooperation contribute, this dialogue between local governments in Europe and Latin America, given our context? Thank you, Agusti. Well, I would like to point out that within the Association of Dutch Municipalities, we work in 35 countries in the world. It used to be, there used to be lots of Latin American countries as well, in Guatemala and El Salvador. But unfortunately, nowadays, we work more in African countries than in Latin American countries. But I believe that decentralized cooperation, the strength it has, is that it is a peer-to-peer process. So it is a true accompaniment of local governments to other local governments, and that is precisely its strength. Because based or starting from different realities, we understand what responsibilities and priorities are within the local governments, and they can receive support by seeing how sanitation systems work, water systems work, but also citizen participation, local tax collection and fundraising, and seeing what things could be worked on in collaboration. That's the strength. In many of the countries where we work, we have seen that after catastrophes, whether natural or through crises such as wars, very frequently cooperation agencies arrive and they immediately go to the local government. They ask for all the information and the data, and then subsequently they support all the necessary processes at that moment, so humanitarian support. But they also forget that it's very important for the local government itself to receive support as well, so that it doesn't lose its capacity to lead and bring the municipality forward. Many times after the Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean, we have been there working in the island of San Martin, which is an island that used to be part of the colonial world of the explaining the tight relationship that we have with San Martin. And we saw that there have been many agencies that had come to work, but nobody was concerned about placing the local government in a position to be able to respond to the needs of citizens. And this, for me, is a problem regarding sustainability, because after having those agencies go away and that humanitarian support is left, the local government remains, and they need to face all challenges in society. And if that local government is not supported to be able to do all this, the system does not really work properly or to its fullest potential. I also believe that the support of decentralized cooperation is very important to prove, thanks to the Sustainable Development Goals. I have it in English in my mind, so it's the opposite. It's the other way around. So we have to prove jointly how to look at the policies that we design locally through an inclusive lens. I see that many ministries nationally, many governments nationally, find it very difficult to see how they can leave their silos. The things they focus on, but it is precisely locally from where we can see all the different topics and see that every policy that we design represents the citizens inhabiting a city as well. For example, mobility policies, inclusive mobility policies that take into account gender, take into account sustainability, take different groups of society into account, so social, economical, all those different types of elements that we can take into account thanks to the inclusive lens, a way of making sure that these policies at a local level are truly inclusive. And this is something that we can promote through decentralized cooperation. And just to conclude, Agustí, I would like to say that what I would like to stress here is that this is not related to cooperation, but it is related to what we're saying here. The interesting thing is that we're talking a lot about the low confidence or trust in democracy, and that is very much the case. But I don't want for all of us to see it super negatively or from the dark side of things, because at least in Holland, this is qualified better than nationally. So there's much more trust in the local government and its politicians than the national government. I don't know whether this is the case. It is the case in the Netherlands, but I don't know whether it is the case in elsewhere. So not everything is negative, and we also need to find the little lights that help us move forward. Thank you. Okay, so I will leave with that positive note, which is essential, bright side of things, to find the light in this discussion. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I wanted to do 2 rounds, but we started late, and it is quite relevant to hear also from the audience. Milagros, can we do that now? Yes. So at any rate, I would like perhaps to have a second round once the audience has intervened. Yes, of course, it is an unpleasant feeling to have things that you want to say you can't say, but we also see the participation from the audience. We saw it this morning, so if you have questions or reflections, comments to make, please raise your hands. Yes or no? Anybody wanting to intervene? You have the floor. We have 2 people for the time being. As I said this morning, I work in a program that aims at social cohesion, and we've always said that social cohesion is undoubtedly linked to the quality of democracy, and we're seeing now how that social cohesion, that social glue, keeping individuals united in a society and a political system and in a community, this is being somehow unglued, and we need to work on it to improve the social cohesion. Dolores was very right in her diagnosis, because she was somehow linking the legitimacy crisis with the capacity crisis. And I would like to ask her, we're going through a time when we need to tackle very complex problems, and I believe that institutions are not ready to tackle this complexity. So we're entering a vicious circle in a way that is somehow causing this discomfort of democracy and citizens. We've spoken about citizen participation, public innovation. Perhaps the local level can be an interesting space to start experimenting, but I also see that there is this fear of experimenting. So how do you tackle this dread or terror? You have had public responsibilities locally, so could you please elaborate on that? And the second question I wanted to ask is that we are living tension moments between two values, freedom and equality. They seem to be confronted. I believe this is not at all true, and it is basically just fallacy, but this is what the political class is communicating, and I believe that citizens have also owned this tension between freedom and equality. How is this affecting democracy? From this proximity that has been constant throughout today, talking about local governments and how proximity is established there, how is this being experienced? Manuela, would you like to answer? Yes? Well, I was going to answer to the second part of your question. We have a very deep feeling of what is happening in the world. On the one hand, we see European democracies here. People are voting less, and what Dolores was saying with all the figures and data. And then we see a plant with many yellow leaves, and then we see a dead plant. The case of Ecuador, the case of Nicaragua, and there's no longer a democracy. It's totally failing, lack of compliance with rights, 35,000 innocents. What does this mean? Well, it strikes me how democracy, or the citizens, what people believe when Hugo was saying that most of people in El Salvador are going to support these measures against the huge insecurity. I believe that when we have dramatic situations in a specific country, citizens, the democracy, it's basically mistaken. It goes wrong. And what happens when in the US, after the terrible attack to the Twin Towers, they decided to invade Afghanistan? There's 240 votes in favor of going into war and 1 against. That was Barbara Lee's vote, and I would ask you to read her speech. It was a moving speech. She said that we're in no serious conditions to make the correct decision. We're going to make a mistake. This is going to be a disaster. She said what was going to happen precisely before having 850,000 dead bodies. And she said so because it was the right thing to do and the minority was right. And if we look at World War I and World War II, especially World War I, were very significant collective. The International Socialist is broken up. This is crazy. Let's not go to war. They were right. So what I mean to say here is that we need to see what the dramatic structures mean in breaking up of societies, and we need to not go there. It's like not going to a coma status. What we're saying with insecurity, social insecurity, many of us said so. When we were calling Congress in Madrid, we were calling it against violence in cities, interpersonal violence in cities. We insist, we're not talking about wars here, we're talking about interpersonal violence, because there can be no societies with interpersonal violence, such as in the level of Mexico or El Salvador. These are phenomena that take us straight to the cliff and to abandoning democracy. So the important thing here is for us to make whatever is necessary to not get to the cliff. Measures have been taken and they have had good outcomes in many cases. That's why it's so important to make exchanges so that it doesn't happen. Why is El Salvador tending towards that violent situation? Well, civil war and the guerrilla probably had a lot to do. I was reading a book on South Africa, The Hairs, talking about the current South Africa and how the terrible apartheid problems rise time and time again. Societies are poisoned, and that's why it's so important to defend democracy. Sorry if I'm talking for too long, but when I think that at the end of the 19th century, the Catholic Church says that democracy is a mortal sin. Well, why? Because it's a structure for governmental organization of human beings that guarantees equality the most. And it's something so valuable that we need to take care of it constantly, seeing all the ways and paths we should not follow. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Dolores Camat, and then Héctor Aguirre. I can just agree. I can only agree with what Ms. Carmena said. There's a sentence that we've repeated over and over while suffering the economic crisis. How much inequality can democracy withstand? In that sense that there are elements that take us to its questioning, and not only political elements, but also things that are related to material standards and security standards of the human beings. So the use of democracy also comes in place here. You were mentioning and you were asking back, I've spoken not about the use only, but also being honest. To look at limitations from the administrations, it is much more acceptable for a citizen when politics says we can get to this point, but we cannot do this, or we cannot do this on our own. This morning we spoken about cooperation, the need to collaborate, and now we were talking about sharing and learning from one another, and also with citizens. In order to provide useful responses today to real problems of citizens, the complex ones, the global, the local ones, citizens are essential. We can do better politics with citizens within the institutions, not only along the formal channels, which of course are essential, as Héctor was pointing out, the need for their existence, but also through other channels. The local power has always innovated participatory councils of minors, of those who cannot vote, children. That has been invented locally, participative budgets. AD was talking before about the victimized women meeting up with police officers. So we've always had that capacity of innovating from the local sphere to running risks as well. And I'm not doubtful at all that we will go back to it, and it's being done once again. Manuela was talking about lotteries, raffles, or other formulas that can be brought onto the table. I want to be provocative, as I said before. We need to think about formulas that do not only individualize participation. We cannot socialize, politicize, or be citizens from our own individual persona. It is true that we have practiced a lot this individualism, so me, myself, and my circumstances, and my smartphones, and I can have all the information and everything I need. And that is not true, because in democracy, the citizen is a social citizen who is part of one or several collectives, and these collective spaces create awareness, consciousness, collective identity, identification, knowing the limitations of politics and the structures. When in my students' assembly I practice and I see that my opinion is not other people's opinions, that is learning as well. That is essential. And these structured of democratic learning, we have been bringing them down, no matter if trade unions, associations, if those are not good for nothing, we need to invent some new ones. But we need to practice that democracy, because that leap from myself to institutions is not always going to give us the solution or the best practice or best recipe. Thank you very much. I agree with Dolores and what she's saying about the individual and the collective. When we're talking about these things about democracy and freedoms, This is such a complex thing for El Salvador that the President of the Republic is going to violate the Constitution. There can be no re-election. He's a candidate. He's an official candidate of the government party. There's social acceptance that is very wise, so he'll probably win. But what is the discussion? What do I care about democracy? He's a good politician, and we no longer have gangs. That is the level of social discussion. And you can find that debate and that discussion in neighborhoods, in buses, in all different spaces. So why should I care about democracy? Over 35,000 innocent people are in prison, and many have been killed, but we have lost our democracy in El Salvador. They can come to your house because they made a call. They have told that you're a gang, and you go into prison. And, well, emotionally, you're finished. They finished you up. So in the case of Latin America, the case of Ecuador, the case of Guatemala, where delinquency is such a difficult phenomenon, our society has been ruptured and shattered because of this. And obviously, there's disasters. And our countries are very young. We just left the war behind only 30 years ago, but we've forgotten all about it. I want to talk about 4 big elements just to close, which I believe are essential. The first one is that it's important for these spaces to allow for our local authorities to improve their knowledge and to have this capacity of understanding the role for which they've been chosen for that social transformation that requires or is required not only in Latin America but also in Europe. The same problems we have here, we have there. Democracy brings new elected authorities, but do these authorities understand the challenge they have so that from local authorities we can hold these discussions with central authorities? Well, that's not as easy as that. Mayors in El Salvador, for example, most are or belong to the party in government. All laws that have been passed, they have not been consulted, and they've accepted all the laws in the public administration. 10% of their budget was taken away from them, and nobody said anything in the government party affecting their own capacity of governing territory with resources. So the phenomenon is very complex. Secondly, promoting new leaderships, and I believe this is very important. These new leaderships can be fostered through these discussions, dialogues, this effort of comprehension that we have in this commitment. We have to elevate our levels of understanding of the phenomenon of democracy. Watch out, as the former mayor has said, taking care of all it. Then strengthening the links of Europe and Latin America, this effort done by the Prevention Council with the institutions, fostering this debate. Well, it's very necessary, both here and there, not only here but also there. This also will allow us to establish or strengthen the networks working for democracy and local development and decentralization of states. And finally, promoting, I insist that these new leaderships allow us to establish common agendas, as we heard this morning, common agendas that will allow us to take all these topics and issues wherever central governments are sitting, both in Europe and Latin America. If we are not victorious with this, we will continue discussing amongst priests, but we will still be sinners.
Thank you so much. I see someone else who's asked for the floor. Thank you. Although, even if you spoke this morning, can you introduce yourself again? Hi. Good afternoon. I am Fabiana Boyaneche, Director for International Relations and Cooperation in Montevideo and Executive Secretary of Mercociudades. I found this panel really enriching, and I think it is a very timely panel that recognizes, and it's great that it came after the panel discussing human rights. Initially, I'd say that tradition tells us that these things are not up for local governments to deal with, and this is why I think it's important for local governments and civil society to build a better democracy and expand human rights. I wanted to highlight several of the things that have been mentioned in other panels. I'm going back to what was said in the previous panel, but I want to monopolize the mic every time. We are talking of democracy now, and We gave really interesting examples, such as the process to adopt a new constitution in Chile. This is a permanent focus of attention for Latin America, even if things seem to be complicated right now. The reality is that that process started thanks to a popular mobilization with a cross-cutting approach, with a strong push from younger sectors of society, as so many of the other advances in Chile. I think it's important to redefine and to build back democracy. We need popular mobilization and the participation of youth, but we've also mentioned things that are putting democracy at risk: the criminalization of people, the criminalization of social movements, the different models of security that are being discussed. And Hector mentioned some of the very serious problems that come with the different security problems. Earlier on, they touched on the issue of organized crime. And I think if we're talking of democracy and human rights, we have to mention this. The illegal transnational economic power is another thing connecting Europe and Latin America, which is putting our region under threat in terms of security, human rights, democracy, and it is also posing a risk to social and economic stability. And if you allow me to say so, I was listening to you and I remembered Michel Foucault and the Life of the Infamous Men, and we were talking about threats to democracy and criminalization and imprisonment. We have prison, hospitals, refugee centers, psychiatric hospitals or wards, are also a micro city within themselves, not so small. I'm from Uruguay, a country with 3 million inhabitants, and there are 50,000 people who are deprived of freedom. And the insecurity index wouldn't lead me to think there'd be such a high level of incarcerated people. These are communities that grow with their back turned on society, and with society turning their backs on them. And all of this is also important when talking about imprisoned population. We turn a blind eye on this, and that is why prisons are usually built in the fringes of a society and are left out of discussions. But if we don't deal with this, it'll also put a risk to democracy, because it's linked to security issue, but also to social, economic inequalities, and it poses a threat to peaceful coexistence. I think the local power of civil society has a lot it can do, and I'm sure they could come up with many answers, or at least many new questions that national governments and nation states have not yet found an answer to. Thank you so much. If you'll allow me, we'll take a last question from the audience, and then we can answer both of them together. We are running out of time. Lili Caravantes had asked for the floor. Well, I have a big question mark. For there to be democracy, and we all know what has happened, when our colleague said, people say, what do I care about democracy if my basic needs are not met? And if the local government isn't able to meet those basic needs of the citizens, where is the academia in all of this? Shouldn't the academia play an important role in strengthening the skills of local government so that they can respond to these needs? In my case, there was a Center for Urban and Regional Studies from the University of San Carlos, which was established with the role of offering technical support to municipalities. During the municipal government that's been in power for more than 20 years, they did away with this relation. We have national disasters with traffic, road traffic accidents, rubbish, water management, because we do not have the voice of the academia guiding us. We have to translate the needs of the population into a technical support that can help politicians find solutions. Thank you. I'd kindly ask our panelists to be short and brief, And after the intervention, we'll move on to Mr. Rosada so we can read the conclusions. Just very quickly, there is no better academia than setting the example. Setting the example is the best academia when you are in politics. It's an ideal place to be a role model and to use this. And this has to do with the ability to listen, to participate in a serious and calm debate. And another important thing I didn't mention, we have to be able to evaluate. Very often we discuss whether something will be good or not, but why don't we say, okay, let's try doing it and seeing whether it was a good idea and whether it was worth it or not. We need to bring in reasonable attitudes in life, from teaching and giving example. I just wanted to highlight the issue of multi-level governance. It hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's important to highlight that when the legal framework isn't adequate and when you cannot implement the national requests at the local level because there are not enough funds, it makes it very difficult for local governments to implement everything they should be implementing. And in this regard, and just to give an example, in the Netherlands we have a code that sets forth how national government should involve local government in the areas of decentralization. Our association carries out a pilot test where we look to see whether there is enough finance to look at the consequences to be able to implement something. And I leave this as an example for you because for us it's been really important. We have followed many decentralization processes, but we also feel that the national government is trying to gain greater control on how we implement our tasks. We can always turn to them and say the code says this, the code says that you should check with us, that you should provide sufficient funds to be able to implement actions, and unless we have these funds we won't do it. There's a lot of discussion about democracy and implementation on a local level, but we cannot forget that this is part of a much broader national European framework, in our case under a European framework, and that these mechanisms must be up and running and must work well. Thank you, Agustin. Fernandez de Losada, can we make some final comments? Yes, I'll be very brief, even if I do think that this panel was extremely inspiring. We had many interesting things, and I'm sure we could talk about this for hours on end, and maybe we can continue later during the cocktail or over dinner. In any case, I think we are all aware how complex the times are. We've heard of concepts like fear, uncertainty, misinformation that put democracy and the quality of democracy at risk, which speed up authoritarian logics. I think is a reality we cannot deny. The former mayor of Madrid told us of the need to take care of our democracy. The logics of care is here to stay, and we are seeing this in Chile and in many other municipalities that are making big efforts to work on everything related to care. And here we can establish a clear link with feminism. We also mentioned the need to deepen our democracy and to make our democracy move forward. Manuela Carmena was saying that we are anchored in forms of democracy that were established more than a century ago. Our democracy responds to logics and mechanics that were created at the end of the 19th century. So moving forward in democracy through processes of citizen participation and direct democracy, I'd include the slight confrontation between representative and direct participatory democracy is something we should tackle. We've also heard about the need to being closer to our citizens and making this proximity more effective. We have to manage the proximity of local governments. But in order for local governments to take care of democracy, in order for local governments to make this proximity more effective, in order for local governments to manage the extreme complexity, governments need clear competencies. On the one hand, they need resources, they need skills, they need to be able to build alliances with civil society and with the academia. Local governments need to be able to lead in a different way, manage in a different way, being assertive, working in a framework of collaboration and non-hierarchical mindsets. And that is where I think that decentralized cooperation and the dialogue that may happen between regions like Latin America and Europe, or the peer dialogue, can contribute to improve the quality of the answers we come up with at a local level. Thank you so much. So during today's intense discussions, we've had two people to summarize the main ideas that came up in each panel and the ideas that are repeated. Please allow me in 1 minute to read out the conclusions or the notes taken by these two people based on all the discussions today. I'm sure things will be left, but I think they will help me of inspiration towards tomorrow's declaration. The forum started off by highlighting the advocacy ability of local governments through their common networks and through the possibility of transformation through innovative public policies and developments. One of the challenges bringing us together here today is how to improve local governance from a local level. How to improve global governance from a local level, how to build fair and egalitarian societies. And for this, we need to become a single united voice. We need to recognize asymmetries and differences. We must unite, generate alliances, and come up with common projects. The strength of local governments is that they are close to the citizens and the territories. However, both regions have crossed looks in silence in recent years, and it isn't good when two partners don't dialogue about the future. That is why we have to celebrate this event. We've identified challenges and opportunities, and we've identified common ground among the two regions. We've seen there is a shared agenda at a local level, and therefore there is room for optimism and for working together. The door is open to continue building on our bi-regional relationship. We have to make sure that the relationships between Europe and Latin America and the Caribbean are not unilateral or vertical. Both regions have a lot to say and a lot to learn from one another. Solutions must be dealt with from a systemic approach and from multiple perspectives. We've recalled that everything happens in cities, in the territories, but resources are not always aligned with the responsibilities. Public policies tries overcoming the consequences of the problems, but not the causes. And we have to deal with the underlying causes of the problems. In relation to the local impact that the renewed EU CELAC strategy may have on the Global Gateway project of the EU, we've said that we should rephrase the question, and rather than asking what the local impact may be, we should ask ourselves, how can the European Union strengthen landing this strategy at a local level? It's state and super-state institutions the ones that need the local level when it comes to implementing their macro strategies. We've also shared the difference between the concept of municipal government and local government. Local government is one which includes a broad variety of civil society stakeholders beyond city council. We've also mentioned how important it is to move out of the paradigm of competition amongst authorities and to move towards the dynamics of collaboration. It's not about taking away space, but it's more about defining an agenda for the new social contract we want to build and to discuss the role of local governments in this new agenda. We have to turn the concept of security around, going back to community. We have to ensure the rights to participate and voice an opinion and regain citizens' trust. Without that, we won't be able to deal with challenges such as the environment. We have to work for the full dignity of people and full rights. And in order for there to be governance, it's essential for civil society organizations to be allies, to bring more humanity into politics and local development. We have to change the way in which we measure local development and measure it in terms of well-being and coexistence. Local governments can neither forget the care economy, which has to be a shared burden and not just done by women. Ultimately, we have to continue supporting decentralization and territorial cooperation processes among the urban and rural environments between large and small municipalities, and we have to encourage direct participation of citizens. In conclusion, as we've had in this panel, we have to care of our democracy as if it were a beautiful garden. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of the other participants in the forum. Tomorrow, we will be able to delve deeper in some of these concepts. I hope you enjoy your afternoon, that you enjoy the city of Barcelona, and I wish you a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Las personas que han participado.
And panelists may come up for a group photo here up front. Thank you.
La foto de familia es de todos los participantes.
And the group picture will be with everyone, because you're all panelists either today or tomorrow. After that, remember, we have the award and the cultural events. I hope you enjoy them. Thank you.
Parece que... Un momento, por favor. Bueno, ahora cuando bajen. A ver. Sí. Bueno, parece que no se ha oído bien la cuestión de la agenda cultural.
So I'll repeat once again on the cultural activities. Please, if I can have your attention for just a second. From the questions we got, it may seem that people didn't understand the culture.